All right, time to review. First up, we're going to take a look at the word gravity. On Earth, gravity is a force that pulls everything down towards the center of the Earth. So, we talked about how gravity is coming from the core of the Earth. That's why on Earth it pulls everything down towards Earth. We also talked about how when two things are near each other, the thing with the greater mass is going to be pulling the other object towards it. So, on your notes on your Google form, I want you to write down in your own words what gravity is. You can take a second to go ahead and pause the video so that you can do that. When you're finished, come back and continue playing the video, and we'll continue with the other words. Next up, we have the word friction. We've talked about friction a lot, especially with the experiments that we did with the marble. So, friction is also a force. It's when two surfaces rub against each other, making it harder for things to slide or move. Another way to think about friction is how it's the resistance of motion. Something with more friction is going to make it harder for an object to move. Less friction means it's going to make it easier for things to move. So, if we think of an example of a skateboard, if you were going to skateboard, you would want to have less friction so that it's not super bumpy and you don't fall off your skateboard. An area with less friction for a skateboard would be like pavement or a sidewalk or really smooth driveway. Something with too much friction or more friction that would not be good for a skateboard would be like gravel, grass, or carpet. So take a second now to pause your video. Go ahead and go back to your Google form and type in your own words a good definition for what friction means. When you're finished, come back and we'll continue the video. Next up, we have mass. I want you to think of it as how much stuff is in something, so what it's made up of. We briefly talked about mass when we talked about how on the moon you weigh more than you do you weigh more on Earth than you do on the moon because gravity is pulling us down with much greater force on Earth than it does on the moon. So we talked about how weight changes on Earth and the moon. We also talked about how mass does not change. So what you're made up of, what makes you you, is going to be the same no matter where you are. So that's what mass is. So take a second to type that down. So remember, mass is how much stuff something has. That stuff we're talking about is specifically matter. All right, if you need a second, go ahead and pause that. When you're ready to move on, come back, play the video, and we will continue. So here's our case study we're looking at. In this experiment, we are comparing how a bowling ball and a marble roll down a ramp. Both objects start at the same height, and we measure how long it takes each object to reach the bottom. We are interested in how gravity, mass, and friction affect their motion on different surfaces. Here are the conditions. The ramp we have is 1 meter long. The surface of the ramp is either going to be smooth or rough, which we will discuss as carpet. We measure the time it takes for each object to roll down the ramp from the same starting point. Type OK in the Google form once you have read all of this with me. Once you do that, come back and it's time to continue. So here are our results from the case study experiment. We have the bowling ball and the marble rolling from both the smooth surface and the rough carpet surface. We have a column that tells us the time that it took to reach the bottom. And then we have some notes. So for the bowling ball on the smooth surface, it took 2.5 seconds to reach the bottom. Some notes were that there was a larger mass, there was less friction on the smooth surface. For the marble, we have that it was a smooth surface. It took 2.4 seconds, so just a very, very slight bit less. It had smaller mass, less friction, and it traveled just a bit faster than the ball. Next up, we have bowling ball on the rough surface, which we tested as carpet. It took 3 seconds, so about half a second longer than on the smooth surface. There was more friction. It slowed it down due to our larger contact area. And lastly, the marble on the rough carpet was also slower than it was when it was on the smooth surface. There was less friction compared to the bowling ball, but it was still slower. So first up question, what two objects are being tested in the experiment? So if we go back, the two objects we are looking at are the bowling ball and the marble. So that's what you're going to write down for this question in your Google form. Take a second to pause it while you fill that in. When you're ready, come back and we will continue. Next question. Based on the data table, what can you determine about how friction affects motion? So looking back at the data table, when we saw more friction, which was the rough carpet, what did we notice happened to the time that it took to get to the bottom? If we look at our notes, we see that it says more friction slows it down. Less friction compared to the bowling ball, but it still slowed. So that's what you're going to write for this one is more friction will cause the object to move slower. I'll give you a second to pause that so you can type that in and then you can continue. And lastly, I want you to kind of think of this on your own. I'm not going to give you the answer for this, but based on what we've been talking about last week and based on what we've talked about this case study today, in at least 4 or 5 sentences, I want you to talk about how friction, gravity, and mass all work together to affect how objects move. So you can tell me individually what these things do. You can talk about it in a case study. You can talk about it from our experiment that we did with the marble in class, but I want you to talk about how all these things come together and have an effect on motion. Once you do that, make sure you get that all typed in your Google form, and then you may continue.